Welcome to Curator's Chronicles, where history takes flight and stories soar. I'm Christian Gurling, your curator and host. Today we delve into an extraordinary and little-known story. Our guest today is Captain Brock Booher, an Air Force veteran who fought in the First Gulf War and now serves as a pilot for Southwest Airlines. In early 2001, just months before the 9/11 attacks, Brock was under contract as a flight instructor with a company called Jet Tech in Phoenix, Arizona. Among his students was Hani Hanjour, the terrorist who would later pilot American Flight 77 into the Pentagon. Although Brock's interaction with Hanjour was brief, it was profound. Sensing something was off about Hanjour, Brock reported his concerns to the manager of Jet Tech. The manager, sharing Brock's unease, contacted the FAA about Hanjour. Although neither could pinpoint the exact issue, they both sensed that something was not right about the situation. Remarkably, in an act of kindness and charity, Brock's wife and kids once gave Hanjour a ride in their vehicle, adding a deeply personal layer to this encounter. It's a chilling juxtaposition, a terrorist intent on harming America and a seemingly ordinary interaction with an American family. This is one man's encounter with Hani Hanjour. Brock will share his reaction to learning that Hanjour, his former student, was responsible for part of the 9/11 attacks and reflect on the impact of that day. Join us for this gripping conversation with Captain Brock Booher, only on Curator's Chronicles. Thank you for joining us, Brock. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
So, first off, let's start out with where you grew up at.
I grew up in a small town in southern Kentucky, Franklin, Kentucky, a little south of Bowling Green, right on the border with Kentucky and Tennessee, on a small farm.
Interesting. Now, what was life like growing up on a farm like that?
Well, the cows always had to be milked, the chickens always had to be fed, and there was always work to be done, and so. We worked hard, we played hard, and had a kind of sheltered life, right? There were a lot of things happening, the Vietnam War and all these other things going on. And I was just living my best life, just being a farm boy and watching airplanes fly over. So
that's a lot of work. And you mentioned airplanes flying over. At what age did you become interested in aviation?
According to my mom, at a very young age, more than once, she would catch me, kind of watching the skies. There must have been probably, I'm guessing, a military low-level route that we either went very close to our farm or right over the top of it. Because on a regular basis in the Vietnam era, the F-105s, the F-100s, the F-4s come screaming over when I would be out working in the fields. And I would just stop everything and watch them and just so enthralled with it.
Yeah, that must have been quite an adrenaline rush, I'd imagine, as a small child.
It was, and I'm down there, hoeing or driving a tractor or taking care of cattle, and I thought, well, that looks like more fun than what I'm doing.
So you kind of felt, called to do that. So you went to college first, is that right?
Yeah, I went through ROTC, Air Force ROTC at Brigham Young University to get my commission and then go off to pilot training after that.
Oh, okay. And so at what point early on did you join the Air Force? And for the Air Force, you wanted to fly. Did you consider other branches of the service as well?
I really didn't know a lot about the other branches. I just thought Air Force flying, right? And so that was my first choice. While I was in Air Force ROTC, before I was fully committed, I took a short look at the Navy and the Army, but they didn't really have what I was interested in. And so I stayed focused on the Air Force.
Yeah, absolutely. So you go to flight school. Talk to us a little bit about the intensity of the training during flight school and what that was like.
Well, I equate it to like a year of final exams. We started with 32 students and we graduated 16, so we lost half of my class. Wow. They either washed out or left, and so there was a lot of intensity, and I know that changes over the years and has changed over the years, but at that time, there wasn't as many pilot slots, and so their way of dealing with that was just making it harder to get through, and so they would just eliminate more people. And so that's, during my time, that's the way it was. So.
Interesting. So the training back then literally would be more intense than say today, probably.
Probably. Again, it's different. It's different today, and the demands are different, and the pacing's different. It's just if you look back at some of the Air Force history, there were times where they said we have too many pilots, so they would really make it difficult on the students because they would then eliminate some of the people in the pipeline to adjust their numbers, and so it could be fairly brutal. And there are other times when there's a little more relaxed. And I'm not saying there's anything that they're less of a good pilot or anything. It was just different. It was just the way, it was the mechanism used during those times to adjust the numbers sometimes.
Yeah, right. So you're flying around, and what sort of aircraft are you flying around in as you're training in the Air Force?
I started in, we did flight screening in Hondo, Texas in the T-41, which was basically a Cessna 172 utility with only 2 seats in it. And then after that, you go to pilot training after you pass the screening. And I flew the T-37, which is no longer in service, and then flew the T-38, which is still in service, the upgraded model of that. So those are the 2 aircraft I flew during pilot training.
Wow. And so along the way, you end up flying the A-10. How did that come about?
Well, you at the end of your pilot training, you fill out what's called a dream sheet. I think it's fairly similar still today. You fill out a dream sheet and say, okay, my first choice is this, my second choice is this, my third choice is this. And then the powers that be, the what's it called, personnel center, sends down a list and says, well, here's what we need. And then so you just hope that what you want matches with what they offer, and that's a luck game. You have no control over that whatsoever. A-10 was one of the top choices for me. I think it was my second choice, and I was lucky enough to be towards the top of the class. So when they looked at my sheet, the guy ahead of me got the F-16, I got the A-10, and so it worked out. It worked out real well, but there were times where you could be qualified to fly anything, and they would say, well, this is all we have, C-130, here you go. And so, you'd like to think it's because of your work ethic and your abilities, and you're just the best pilot, but it's really not. A lot of it's luck.
So the F-16 was your first choice?
It was my first choice, but having had the experiences that I've had, I'm really glad.
Yeah.
I never flew the F-16 operation. I got a chance to ride in the back one time, but I really loved flying the A-10. It was a great airplane and a great mission.
Yeah, what was flying that like? I mean, 'cause everybody loves the A-10, of course.
Yeah, I describe it as like a big, it's just solid, just a war machine. It maneuvered well, it lost energy, it wasn't really good in a dogfight, particularly at medium altitude, but you could deliver a punch like nobody else with the weaponry, with the gun, that GAU-8, and then all the other armament that you could take into battle. I mean, you could really put the hurt on the enemy and with that aircraft. And it, if you flew it right, in a high threat environment, you could it would survive. And so it was just a great airplane. In fact, proof is, I haven't been able to replace it truthfully because there's nothing like it. And it's designed to do what it does better than anything else, that close air support, and it just does a great job.
Yeah. And and you mentioned combat, and so you also flew combat missions during the first Gulf War. Can you tell us about this experience and what that was like?
Yeah, and I'm cautious to say I flew combat around real combat pilots because it was fairly boring when I was there. But here's what we would do. We patrolled northern Iraq during the Kurdish refugee relief mission. Saddam Hussein started attacking the Kurds in northern Iraq at the end of the first Gulf War before we had really stopped patrolling the skies there. And Bush Sr. said, nope, can't do that. So we immediately began flying over northern Iraq, and we were authorized to, if the Republican Guard moved, we were gonna take them out. And so we were there more as a deterrent. So we would leave Incirlik Air Force Base in Turkey. We'd fly about an hour to the border with Iraq, Turkey and Iraq, and then we'd hit the tanker, we'd refuel, and then we'd drop into Iraq and we'd patrol around. And our orders said, "Fly so as to make your presence known," which meant we would buzz Main Street, we would buzz the Republican Guard while they're out doing calisthenics in the morning, and most days were pretty boring. I never had to fire a shot. Nobody shot at me that I know about, so it was pretty calm when I was there. But every day we went ready to fight and prepared to deliver the ordnance and do what was needed. Fortunately, like I said, for me, it was pretty calm during the time I was there, and so, but it was intense some days, even though nothing, like I said, I'm cautious to say I've got, quote, combat time when I know there's pilots out there who really have some real serious combat time. Mine was fairly benign.
Right, but I mean, it's just as important. As you mentioned, it was a deterrent factor. Without you guys up there, who knows what would have transpired? Mm-hmm.
Right, and for many days I thought it was a waste of time and a waste of efforts. And then years later, I was in Dallas at a grocery store, and I noticed that all the checkout people had an accent. So I asked them, "Well, where are you all from?" And they said, "We're all Kurds from northern Iraq." Yeah. And so I began talking to them and found out that they got out of northern Iraq during the time that I was patrolling the skies there. So they got to safety, were able to immigrate and start over again because of my efforts there. And so that was a very rewarding conversation.
Absolutely. Wow. That just, that really hits home. And that everything came full circle.
Yes,
so
it did.
After you're out of the Air Force, you're a flight instructor at this point. Is that right? Mm-hmm.
I left the Air Force and was started working at Southwest Airlines. And I was an instructor. Oh, after the A-10, I was an instructor in the Air Force in the T-37.
Okay.
And then I got out of the Air Force years later. And then I began instructing at a place called Jet Tech. And they did, to apply at Southwest Airlines during that time, you had to have a type rating in the 737.
Okay.
So that school specialized in providing accelerated training for type ratings in the 737. And so pilots who were interested in going to Southwest Airlines, or you just wanted to get a leg up on the competition, would come and take the 2.5 week course on the 737 and get a type rating on their ticket for the Boeing 737. And I was an instructor there. After I got my type rating, they needed help. They knew about my background with as an academic instructor and a T-37 instructor, and I became an instructor for them and was working at Southwest Airlines at the time as well.
Interesting. So, and this is around, so you were under contract with them as a flight instructor at Jet Tech, as you mentioned. And so we cut to early 2001 here. So this Jet Tech, it's owned by Pan Am International Flight Academy. And this is in Phoenix, is that right? In Phoenix, Arizona?
That's correct. Yep, they're in Phoenix, not too far from the airport. They had a facility.
So tell us about the day that September the 11th hijacker, Hani Hanjour, who was the pilot of the Boeing 757 that struck the Pentagon, walked into your class of students that you had.
Yep, I had a small class that day, and I still keep in contact with the other two students. We've been related professionally and see each other professionally from time to time. So I only had two students, and they said, "Hey, you're going to have a third student in the back auditing the class." So they said, "Treat him like you would, the other two students. We just want to see how he's going to do." And I said, "Okay." So we start the class. I introduced myself. He's in the back of the room. He's got a real thin, one of those cheesy mustaches. He's got a New York Yankees ball cap on, a white T-shirt, and blue jeans. And he reminded me of like a mouse, waiting to snatch the cheese. And just really, I can only say he was mousy. He was quiet. He was unassuming. He failed the pretest. All the students had to pass a pretest to prove that they had done their pre-study to be able to pass this accelerated course. The other two students passed with flying colors, and he failed it miserably, and his English was terrible. And so I was pretty unimpressed from the beginning and thought something was off with his behavior. So, yeah, that was my first impression.
So he already had a commercial multi-engine certificate at this point that he had received in the late 1990s, as I understand it. What sort of training was he interested in at Jet Tech, and what sort of certificate was he after there?
He was after the Boeing 737 type rating. Yeah, you're right. He had the commercial instrument. He had a brother that lived in Tucson. So he'd been in the United States multiple times before. So in terms of immigration, nothing looked terribly out of the ordinary in that situation. It just didn't feel right. Sometimes you just can't put your finger on. Now you can look back and go, oh, duh. But at the time, I thought something's odd. And so after when the first break happened, we took a break. I walked into Peggy's office. She was the manager there at the time. I closed the door. And I said, what's up with this guy? He didn't pass the pretest. He barely speaks English. Said something's off. And so she goes, I'm wondering the same thing. Let me talk with the FAA. So she went, talked with the FAA, ran it up the flagpole, so to speak. And they're like, nope, it all checks out. He's good. And because of her efforts, that the FBI kind of paid attention and saw this. There's the Phoenix memo that didn't get noticed. An FBI agent, I guess, in Phoenix said, hey, we got a lot of Arab immigrants that kind of have some shady background. They're all in flight training. This may be something. Mm-hmm. But it was, you could put the dots together in hindsight, but you couldn't put them together beforehand. But that was because of Peggy's efforts with the FAA to kind of highlight and make sure that he was who he said he was. So kudos to her.
Absolutely. Wow. Whose idea was it for when you guys were having this discussion about him? Whose idea was it to contact the FAA? Was it like a mutually agreed decision?
She suggested it. I just was the one that kind of said something's off, and she goes, well, let me talk to the FAA. And I said, that's a great idea. So it was more her idea than mine. I was just kind of raising the flag myself to go, something doesn't feel right. And she took the ball and ran with it. And the interesting thing is, she's also the one that interacted with him a great deal more on a regular basis, because he would come to her with help with housing, with transportation, with meals. And she bent over backwards. She and the other staff that were there at school bent over backwards and treated him with extreme kindness and help, like you would any customer. And so she was impacted, I think, a great deal more emotionally by the betrayal than was I, because she had a lot of interaction with him, and again treated him with kindness and respect, like you would any good client. So.
Yeah, she was very emotionally invested in that. Wow. And I understand, you tried to help Hani Hanjour out as much as you could as well, being the flight instructor there at Jet Tech. And so tell us about the story. So I guess, your wife with your kids in tow even gave him a ride?
Yeah, so, typical the first day, a lot of times we would treat the students to lunch. So, I bought him lunch the first day. We all had lunch together. So you're kind of trying to get a feel for who this person is. And then fast forward a bit. I mean, he struggled in the class. So he needed extra training. So one night I was down there working in the simulator, or about to get in the simulator, and he and his simulator partner were coming out. And he and his simulator partner was from Morocco, not connected with the terrorists, but same ethnic background. And so they were trying to go to a restaurant that served food from their region, right? I mean, it makes sense. And there are several nearby. And so my wife brought me dinner, and she's there with my youngest son and our youngest daughter. And so she goes, well, introduce yourself. We talked, a little bit, And she asked, I think, a couple of questions about Morocco or something, right? Just being friendly. And then she goes, well, where do you need to go? And they said, oh, we're trying to go to this restaurant. It's over here. And she looked at the address. She goes, oh, I'm going that way. Why don't you guys jump in the van with me and I'll just take you there. And so they here, one of the 19 hijackers jumps in my minivan with my wife and two of my kids, and she drops them off at dinner, and we thought nothing of it, of course, until all the news comes out, and you're like, wow, oh, it was just chilling, right? It's just so surreal. You almost can't wrap your head around it. So
there wasn't any red flags on her part as to how that he might have been behaving abnormally.
Well, it's difficult, right? There's a cultural barrier there.
Right.
There's a language barrier there. And so to her and to me, he's just another foreign customer that you're trying to help. And so she helped. And she thought he was quiet. She thought he was a little, again, just, you're kind of going, well, he's a little different, but you chalk that up most of the time to just the cultural differences that occur when you go to a foreign country, or someone from a foreign country comes to your country, because that's the way it is, right? So she never really thought anything sinister, but when you look back, you can see now I know I had that feeling, but I didn't know what it was.
Right. And so he's at Jet Tech. At what point did he leave Jet Tech?
Let's see. He started in February. I think he left in early May, but I'm not 100%. I think he was there a couple of months. He kept trying, and what he would do is when he would struggle to get through something, he would need additional training, and that required additional money. And his story was his father was a pilot in Saudi Arabia, so he'd have to talk to his father, and his father would wire him money. That's the way this was working. So when the FBI began to investigate, because he had to wire so many funds, they had all that account information. They would trace the money right back to Al-Qaeda.
Interesting. So he's there a couple of months. Did you have any other interactions with him?
Just in the classroom. I'm in the classroom. I think I taught for 3 days. See him around the building. I didn't do any of this simulator training. I did talk to some of the pilots that or instructors that did a simulator training, and they were just shaking their heads. They're like, he can't fly his way out of a paper bag. I'm surprised he's got a commercial ticket. So, but, at the time, you're again, like I said, they're a customer. You're doing your best to help them.
Mm-hmm. And you said, you'd see him around the school. Was he somebody that was, you mentioned he was timid, but was he at least, when he got to know you, at least, friendly and, wave at you or say hi or?
No, I would say no. I mean, he was just unresponsive, right? I mean, if he needed something from you and you talk, but I mean, again, I've traveled a lot. I've lived in foreign countries. I speak a foreign language, and so I understand the cultural barrier, but this was different. It was just like he didn't want to react, and you could almost sense that he didn't want to interact. So, and that's like, maybe that's what, that was the red flag that we all felt. I was like, okay, this just doesn't feel right. But it's hard to tell in the moment.
So after 2 or 3 months, he leaves Jet Tech, and before September the 11th happened, did you think any more about him at all, or was he just, another student that came and performed poorly and then just left?
He was just another student because, and again, we taught students from the Ukraine, we taught students from Tunisia, we taught students from Australia. So it wasn't unusual for us to have foreign students at the school there. We did a lot of that. So to me, he was just, he's a Saudi Arabian guy who couldn't fly very well and eventually moved on, and like, good luck, right?
Right.
So that was about it.
Yeah. How did you first hear about the attacks on September the 11th and that Hani Hanjour was involved and piloted American Flight 77?
So 9/11, I was home. I was supposed to start a trip the next day, start flying the next day. So I was home. I'd just gone for a run. I come back in the door, and my wife starts yelling, come here. And, the phone has been ringing and everybody's wondering where I am, wonder if it's me, that sort of thing, right? Like you would expect.
Right.
And so I watched this all unfold from, the couch in my living room, right? Like most people did. Horrifying. And it was I want to say Monday of the next week, right? So the initial information, I almost couldn't watch the news. It was just overwhelming to me, right?
Yeah.
And so the initial news began to come out and the information about the hijackers, and I was driving, driving down the freeway, actually to go deliver some training in a simulator for Jet Tech or Pan Am, and I heard his name over the radio, and I just about lost it. So I had to pull over. I had to stop driving. I called Peggy, and they're like, "Where are you?" And I'm like, as soon as she said that, I go, "Was it really him?" And she goes, "Where are you?" And I'm like, "Oh no, it was really him." And so there were some tense moments, a little bit of emotion, or not a little bit, a lot of emotion at the moment. Pretty distracted as an instructor that night, but I went ahead and did my job. But then you begin to wrestle then with all the questions in your mind about, why didn't I see this? Why could have done something about it? How could they do this? We treated him so well, and look at the way now look what he's done, right? And you just begin to just ask yourself all those what if questions, and you feel guilty, for not being able to do something about it, for not recognizing it. You feel like you own a piece of that, and that's not hard. I mean, that's hard to deal with some days. And even my wife was like, "Why didn't we see this?" In fact, her interaction was so little, and she still felt that way. So it's a natural, I think, reaction to just simply be in shock and to ask yourself all those what if questions.
How things could have been, just absolutely natural, yeah. So did the FBI contact you since you had these interactions with him?
They didn't, because he only, quote, audited my class.
Okay.
And so they went, they looked and saw who his instructors were, and they contacted all them and had a discussion. So that's why I kind of surprised the FBI and Peggy and everybody. When they looked at the information, my name wasn't attached to him as being in the first class, even though he was. And they're like, "Oh yeah, that's right. He was in your class the first day." And then they began to remember the conversation, et cetera. So the FBI at that point had so much information, they didn't need to talk to me. They could follow that money trail right back to the Al-Qaeda accounts through him. And that's part of the reason they were so sure that it was Osama bin Laden.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so, knowing that, you were saying that, early on he was performing very poor on these tests, and then some of the other instructors as well had talked about, what a poor pilot he was, even given the fact that he had his license. Was there a part of you that was surprised that he was the one that was piloting American 77 when it slammed into the Pentagon?
Yeah, of course. Just because, again, knowing his capabilities and his preparation, I was really a bit surprised. But it is, if you remember the feedback or the historical context of that, supposedly his target was the Capitol building or the White House, but he apparently couldn't find it or whatever, and so he did what he did, and found the nearest, biggest target and did that. So I don't know. It's just it's hard to fathom. But yeah, I was a bit surprised.
Do you still think about your interactions with him, or is it's been obviously several years since September 11th now, but do you think about that, or does the anniversary kind of rehash some of this?
Oh, absolutely. And we've had, my wife and I, we got a chance to go to the 9/11 memorial in New York, and they show, we walk through that memorial, seeing all the destruction and, firsthand, and all the heroic stories of all the firefighters and first responders. And then you walk through this little section where they talk about the 19 hijackers, and there was his picture.
Wow.
And I got to tell you that was hard. That was hard. Yeah. So, yeah, there's that hole will never be completely closed, but that's okay. That's okay. We're past it. We've learned to accept the history as it was. Learned to accept the fact that no matter what we decided to do, given the situation we were in, he had chosen to do that evil act, and nothing we could have done would have convinced him otherwise.
Right. Or nothing you would have done, could have prevented him from doing that. And so,
short of being able to see the future and just decide to take his life, which is something that I wouldn't choose to do. But, you ask yourself those questions. So,
yeah, sometimes, looking back in history, and yeah, you do ask yourself those questions, whether they're really rational or not. It just seems to be a natural grieving process, if you will, in a way.
Yeah, it is. It is.
So what do you think, looking back to September the 11th, 2001, what do you think the legacy of the attack is? And how do you think that's shaped America for better or worse?
Well, I think there are several things that are legacies from those attacks. Number one, I would say first is the heroic response of the American people, those people who decided they were going to go join the military and go fight. The first responders and those amazing stories, and volunteers. There's several books out there about the Twin Towers and the oral history in New York, and volunteers who just started feeding the first responders. Just things just sprang up overnight. And so, we're a very resilient people. We're very generous. We're very responsive to crisis in general. And I think that's a legacy from 9/11. We responded with resilience. We were sucker punched. And because of that sucker punch, we made a lot of changes with security. We made a lot of changes with our approach in the world. I personally, I choose to continue treating people with kindness and respect, but I fully understand that evil exists in the world that can only be dealt with by force. And so I think that's a legacy for me personally, that I even when I was in the military, I thought, well, my enemy, the Russians, right, my Russian enemies,
right, were
more like an adversary than an enemy, someone whose philosophies and national goals didn't align with mine, so therefore I needed to help deter them. But I never viewed them as like an evil enemy. It was just someone that I was competing with, right, on a national or international scale. But with the 9/11 hijackers, that's an evil that we don't really fully understand. And it's an evil that only can be dealt with by force, because there's no rationalizing, there's no reasoning with someone who wants to kill you no matter what you do or how well you treat them. And that's essentially what he did.
And willing to take their own lives for their cause.
Yeah, exactly. So in the end, you go, okay, there's a small segment of people out there who the only way to deal with them is by force. That's it. That's the only way. Now, it's a very small segment. It's not a big segment, but we have to be aware of that fact.
Right. Now, you obviously, even, despite your experience with Hani Hanjour, you've lived a fascinating life and everything you've been through, and so you've actually written several books as well, and so you're an author. Tell us a little bit about some of your books, and after you tell us about your books, where can we find them and read them?
Oh, thank you. Well, I had this crazy notion a few years ago. I read a book by a favorite author, turned it over. It wasn't that good. It was okay. I turned it over, and it was a New York Times bestseller. So I said, a typical arrogant pilot, right? I said, well, I could do that, And so that made me start thinking about, well, what would I write about it? So I began this process of, I've always been a big reader and enjoy novels and still do, just love to read. And so I started this process, and I found that I enjoyed it. So I wrote a couple of novels. They got published. You can find them on Amazon.
Okay.
One is a coming-of-age story about a young man in 1955 in eastern Kentucky that discovers he has a gift of healing, and it jumps off from there. Not a religious book per se, but it touches on a whole lot of themes of the day of 1955. And then I have a speculative fiction book about a street orphan in the near future in Lima, Peru, who agrees to have a chip implanted in his hand that allows him to purchase food and clothing, and discovers that it does things he didn't expect. So those are a couple of novels, and then short stories are out there in different places, and essays, etc. And then I wrote a couple of kind of self-help books for the LDS community about choices you make, equating that to the ejection decision. And then I just recently wrote a book on risk and resource management called Risk Safety Expertise, which kind of explains the model that we use at Southwest Airlines to manage risk and use our resources. And it's written for it's written for any pilot, but particularly like the pilot in the commercial phase that is needing some extra tools to manage risk and become truly a professional risk manager in aviation. And that was a joy to write with Katie Van Dree. And so those are all on Amazon. You can find all of them on Kindle or in print, either one.
Okay. And any other future books on the horizon?
Well, I've got a couple that are sitting on the shelf that I need to finish. I've been quite busy lately with in the process of writing the last book with Katie. Her business is called Volant Systems. And in the course of writing that book, one day she looks at me and says, "Why don't you take over the company?" and asked me to take over the small aviation consulting company that she had built. And so we managed to make that happen. And so I'm now the proud owner and president of Volant Systems. And so that has kept me quite busy. And I'm looking forward. I've got 4 more years to retirement, so I'm looking forward to working with that and helping that grow. And continuing the legacy that she began with some wonderful risk management and software products to help airlines manage their training programs.
A busy life indeed. Well, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. So
yeah. Well, you got that right. I'm a pretty dull boy most days, but that's okay.
Well, I want to thank you, Brock, for joining us. You know, your story has just been absolutely amazing, and really giving us a glimpse into one of the 9/11 hijackers. And most people have probably not heard your story, so I really appreciate you joining us today and talking about your experience.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I just hope people recognize, history is to be learned from, not to be judged. And there's that's what I've learned from the experience too. Is like history's messy, and it's good just to get in that mess a little bit and try to grapple with some of these difficult questions.